Come on, baby boy. Lay on daddy's lap. Yes. Such good boy. He says, help me. Hello, my name is Jonathan Best. I am the husband of Chelsea Face, who runs this channel. I've been reading too, but my reading takes a lot longer than her reading. I read at a slower pace, and my books were really thick.
Yeah.
So, with 2 C's.
So for this video, I wanted to just interview him about the 3 books, the trilogy that he just finished. He has been really into it and finally finished them after a few years of slowly but surely reading through them at night. And I thought it'd be fun to just get his opinion on them and see what he has to say. And I thought you guys might be interested in hearing a little bit of his opinion. Give us a little bit about, like, where can they find you at?
You can find me on Instagram at Samurai Clyde as my personal account. If you want to follow my martial arts business, which is where I post most of the time. Most of my social media posting is through my martial arts business. That is a Best Academy, BESTS Academy on Instagram, and Best Academy of Martial Arts on YouTube. So,
I'll be sure to link everything in the
Best Academy of
description.
Martial Arts on YouTube.
So you guys can follow him. He does a lot of martial arts, karate stuff. It's really cool.
My YouTube channel is really cool. Check it
Yeah.
out. I put a lot of work into it.
Oh yeah, he does. Tell us the author and title and I guess the theme of this world story.
Well, the trilogy I've been reading is called the Night Angel Trilogy. It's by Brent Weeks. So the first one was a New York Times bestseller. It's called Way of the Shadows. All of the graphic design on these books I think are garbage. They don't really show... this isn't what I think of when I read this book at all. Same thing for the other 2. The second one's called Shadow's Edge. And the third one is called Beyond the Shadows. I would not know that if I wasn't looking at it because all the titles are very similar. It's like something with shadows, shadow, something, something. The series itself is deeply rooted in fantasy and the lore is super, super deep. So if you're not into like knowing, keeping up with certain cities, like knowing the geography within the book and keeping up with a lot of plethora of different characters, then it might not be for you. It's super deep. Like, I don't really want to compare them, but like Tolkien, you know, there's like different races, there's different, it's just a whole world within itself with different languages and different groups within those races, you know, so it's just a lot of stuff going on. The first book introduces us to our protagonist, who starts out named Azoth. Through the tale, he gets a different name, Kylar? That's bad. I read this. Kylar with an A. He starts off named Azoth. He ends up having to get a new identity because he's being taken in by an assassin or a wet boy. They look down on assassins because assassins are like wet boys, except wet boys have a magic called the talent. So they use all kinds of different terminology, like how we would say like a hitman and a target. They would say like a wet boy and a debtor. So the debtor is the target. So it's got its own world that you have to learn. The first one's a pretty self-contained story. It does well introducing you to the core group of characters, and it starts with them being very young. The most amount of time passes in the first book. They're very young, and they grow into pretty much adulthood. The second book, Shadow's Edge, is a good continuation of the first one. It's got all the same characters. The stakes are amped up. The main antagonist is a bigger, badder version of the antagonist from the first book. So it's always exciting to see. It's pretty much a situation where it's the same story almost, except they turn it up a notch. And actually, one of my favorite arcs in this series takes place in the second book, which is about a character who is locked in a prison that most of the world has forgotten, and the people who are in charge of the prison don't feed the prisoners accurately or well enough, so they have to like eat each other and stuff. And then there's a king who is locked in that prison with them, and he has to bring all these cannibals and just people who have done these inhuman things, and he has to bring them together and lead them as a king. You know, it like shows his king-like qualities. Anyways, I think that's my favorite arc in the whole book, and it's in this one. I think this is actually my favorite book of the trilogy. The third one, Beyond the Shadows, very political. Like, this one gets really political. Everything comes together at the end, and the lines of good and bad are very blurred, because you have people who were good who ended up becoming kings of nations that have done terrible things, and they end up having to do terrible things to secure that seat at the top of this nation. And it becomes a question, this one's very philosophical, on the question of, like, at what point is it no longer a means to an end? Mm-hmm. At what point are you just doing bad stuff?
Yeah.
Like, how far can you take it before you're the bad guy?
Okay.
Even if you're trying to do the right thing.
Well, I have a couple questions for you.
Okay.
I know you said political, so I said, like, are there any political themes within the book?
Not as black and white as, like, it doesn't really share any semblance to the real world. Like, it's not like, oh, these are the Democrats and these are the Republicans or anything like that. But there's definitely political themes, the most so in Beyond the Shadows, because there's a void, like there's a vacuum. The first book is about a bad dude. Like, he was just a bad dude. He did something terrible to the main character when he was a kid, and then he comes back as an adult, and he ends up being the main bad guy of the book, and he ends up, paying the price.
Yeah.
And then the second book, his father is the antagonist. And he ends up being the God King of a nation. So he's just like this big evil dude, right? And you're in charge of, assassinating this God King. This people fear him as a god, and it's pretty interesting. But it's very black and white. It's like this is evil and this is good, and the good people are fighting the evil people.
Yeah.
What's interesting is whenever he kills the God King, the third book, like I said, is very political because it creates a power vacuum. An ally to the main character, who has been what we've seen as good throughout the whole series, ends up trying to take the throne of the God King that's been killed.
Yeah.
In doing so, the only way he can get his nation to respect him and take him seriously is to do some of the evil things that the God King before him did. Because you can't just change a nation overnight. You have to gain their respect and their way of living and things. Which his plan is to change over time, but he still, initially he still has to do these really terrible things to gain that position.
Okay. Are there any naughty adult things in these books?
Yes, there is. My face got red a couple of times. It's definitely not the main focus. Like, it's not a romance novel by any means. There's a lot of play of this couple. Like, the main romance arc of these books is between the main protagonist and Kyler and a girl named Eileen, who grew up with him, and the antagonist of the first book, who did that terrible thing to him, also did some terrible things to her, and in doing so messed up her face. So she has these scars. The world sees her as ugly, but Kyler sees the beauty in her, and blah blah blah.
Yeah.
And it goes about, like, he's in his 20s, by the end of the first book, and he's still a virgin, and he ends up having to live with her, and that describes the sexual tension between them and everything. And then by the end of the second book, there's a love triangle going on, because there's another wet girl, I guess, a wet boy, that's a girl, who joins the picture, and she's in love with Kyler. She uses her body because apparently she's very sexy lady, and she uses her body and her work a lot to get men to do what she wants them to do, or to lure them into a space alone so that she can kill them or whatever. Okay. So she's used to using her body and her looks as her weapon. Yeah, exactly. There's a lot more than that, but it would take a long time for me to get into it.
But it does have some romance in it.
There's some romance, and there is some scenes that I'm like, woo! Like, that's a lot. Like, that was very descriptive.
So it's got some stuff for the ladies.
Yeah, I suppose.
Okay. How does this book portray the women?
That's interesting. So I feel like that's really broad, because
is
women...
it stereotypical, or is it actually some strong...
When you say stereotypical, do you mean like damsel in distress?
Yes. Like, is it very typical of stories involving women and men?
I wouldn't say so, because there's only two like main characters that are involved in. Actually, I would say no completely. There's Aline, who's the love interest I was talking about with the scars on her face, and she doesn't fight, but her thing is that she's very religious. She believes in like the one God, and a lot of her characters revolves around her trying to do the right thing in the eyes of God.
Mm-hmm.
And so she doesn't really fight. She does get captured at one point, but she saves herself. Like it's not someone comes up and saves her or anything. V is a very strong woman. She's the wet boy girl I was talking about. She's badass. She's awesome. There's like a whole thing about Logan, who is the king I was talking about in the prison earlier. There's a whole arc where a big event that happens in the book. I forgot what they call it, but there's a name for it, where there's a revolt within a nation, and the way that they kick it off is by all the brothels, like all the women that were working just on the same night, they all agreed together that they were going to kill every man that came to them.
Mm-hmm.
So like every soldier of this army that was invading their country or whatever. So they killed like thousands of men in one night just by like, they would get a suitor, they'd bring him in, they would seduce him, they would kill him, chunk him out the door. Another one would come in, they would just do it all night. Like
Interesting.
Kill. And all of those women, or not all of them, but Logan ended up having a bodyguard of these women on the battlefield, and they called it the Order of the Garter or something like that. So all of his bodyguards, was made up of women, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, that's very cool. Are there any people, if you could tell, of color or LGBTQ in these?
I don't think I remember anyone of color. Well, I mean, it's fantasy.
They didn't really describe anyone's color?
Well, yeah, I mean, they described it, but no one was like... So, one of the main... There's so many characters in this book. One of the characters is named... is it Fear? No, it's not Fear. It's Solon. So, Solon, S-O-L-O-N, he is he comes from a nation where they thrive off of, like, fishing and being on the ocean. Like, they're big sailor type people. And the way they're described is, like... They describe the different races as like being like very sun bleached, like, or not bleached, but suntan, like leathery skin. Or I didn't really see it as like black and white, but I also didn't really see them as like human. Like you see, as it was like a whole nother. It was like a different world with different ethnicities within that
different
world.
Races and ethnicities.
Yeah, it wasn't really like, I didn't see any white people either. It was just like...
Yeah, I know for books, unless they're very specific on the description of the characters, you don't really know what races anyone is.
I mean, they described them. They didn't really describe anyone as being like super, super, super dark. I didn't really see that as a problem of misrepresentation, you know, like black or whatever ethnicity, as much as just like, these are people in another world entirely. Yeah. Like, everyone was kind of a shade of brown. Like, it was just, they were all very dark, like sun tanned.
Yeah. LGBTQ, anything?
Yeah, there was a gay character. There's the main character's best friend from when he was a child was gay.
Okay, so it was a man, woman?
It was a man. He ends up being the leader of the underground organization that controls everything, and he ends up being assassinated.
So he was a bad guy?
No, he was a good guy. His assassination ends up being a huge plot point.
Okay, so he helped move the story too.
Yeah, he helps move the story along with him. He ends up being a major character in the second book, but he's assassinated by the end of the second book, so...
Okay.
Yeah, he doesn't really...
Okay, so I see the book came out in 2008. Do you think the series has aged well since it's 2019 right now?
It's been a few years, but, I mean, there's nothing... It's not really political in the sense of, you know, our politics, like our problems don't really make sense in their world. It's a completely different world with a completely different set of problems. I don't think it's going to have a problem aging because it doesn't really relate to us. There's nothing really xenophobic or anything like that in it. Like
there's no racial slurs.
There's no racial slurs. I don't see it having a problem aging.
That's good, because I know that's a lot of issues with books that I've read.
Oh, yeah?
There's a lot of racial slurs still in them because they were written in like...
They don't really use human racial slur. Like, they don't say human things. Like
they make up their own.
Like, they might use a racial slur, but it's a racial slur for the for the Caldorians or something. Like, it's not something that we would use.
Something they created.
Yeah, it's all in that book.
Would you recommend these?
Yes. Like, I'm not an avid reader. Read a bit when I was in college. Like, I read the Hunger Games series, which I know isn't like, yes, I read the Hunger Games. This trilogy, this Night Angel trilogy, is really my first big step back into reading. I enjoyed myself a lot. I thought these were great. It's just overwhelming for me a little bit. Like, my biggest problem why it took me so long is because when you stop reading, you're scared to jump back into it because there's just so much going on.
Yeah, especially with fantasy.
Yeah. The key is to read a little bit every night, because it's really good about ending on a note that makes it like cliffhangering, right? But when it goes to the next chapter, now you're doing something else.
Mm-hmm. And
then it'll cliffhanger that, and then it'll do something else. And it'll cliffhanger that, and now you're back to the original thing that cliffhangered, right? So it hops back and forth between all these different stories. They all commingle. It's not just three irrelevant things, but they'll have multiple stories going on at any one time. It's really fun. There are some really fun moments. I will say that the ending to the third one happened so quick. It's not really bad. It's not a bad ending. It didn't leave me like disappointed, but I also kind of felt
rushed,
underwhelmed. Not disappointed, but underwhelmed. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Like, you spent so much time on these, and not that it was disappointing, but it was also kind of not what you expected it to be.
Yeah, and it just kind of ended. I will say that I'm surprised. Like, I was hoping they would end the romance arc in a certain way, but I figured they wouldn't. I thought that, no, they're not going to do this. And then they did it, and I was like, oh, well, that's kind of cool. Like, I'm actually kind of happy with the way it ended. The main love interest of the book with the scars on her face, I don't really like her that much, because she's just so good and pure and I don't know, I just don't like characters like that. Like, I like characters with flaws, like, even if they're still lovable, like, they need to be flawed in some way. And I felt like Kyler, the main character, being like, he kills people, like, that's his thing. Like, he brings justice. He's a killer, but he kills the people who needs to be killed.
Like a Robin Hood of murder.
Yeah, and she was like so worried about the way she looked in the eyes of God, and like, she was so good and pure that it just didn't really make sense for them to work out. Like, it was just like, the book was pushing it so hard, and I was just like, I don't really think this is gonna be a thing. Like it might end up being in the book, but I don't think this would really work. That actually, and then there's the third woman in the love triangle, V, is just like in love with Kyler. She's extremely, very deadly. She kills people too. She understands what it's like to be a wet boy, smoking hot. Yeah. and Kyler thinks so too. I don't know. It just made more sense. Like, they had more in common. Like, him and Elaine were like polar opposites, and V and him have so much more in common. The end of the book, spoiler! The end of the book is Elaine ends up dying. She sacrifices herself to like save everything.
Yeah.
Through her wishes, he ends up being with V. Like, they end up taking care of each other, and they become an item. So I was like, oh wow, they actually did it. I didn't expect them to. I thought it was just gonna be like, and then they somehow worked it out.
Yeah.
So
I like to give ratings.
Uh-huh.
So I don't know how you'd want to do it. Would you want to rate each book 1 to 5, or would you want to just rate the whole series?
Maybe both.
Okay.
Because I give the first book a 4 out of 5. I'd give the second book a 4.5 out of 5. And I'd give the third book a 3.5 out of 5.
Okay.
And then overall, 4 out of 5.
4 out of 5. That's pretty good.
Yeah, and that's it. The last book isn't bad, even though it's my least favorite of the series. It's not bad. It's just slower.
Yeah.
It's much slower than the first 2 books.
It's a wrap up.
It's much more psychological and philosophical.
Yeah.
What is good, what is bad, that type of thing, which I enjoy.
Well, thank you so much for this lovely little interview. I thought it would be fun to do, and I might do it from now on when you finish books, since it does take you so much longer.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
if it's like a longer video. I hope you guys will go follow him on his social medias. He works really, really hard on his videos, and sometimes I'm in them.
Yeah.
And we love to read. We love to talk about books together. Every time we finish one, we'll talk about it, or we'll just like talk about them in the bed whenever we finish reading for the night. And this is our son. He's crazy. Thank you so much for doing this with me, babe.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
Say bye.
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 Like and subscribe.